welcome to Chore Chapters, because everyday tasks need good company. I'm Leo, and with me as always, we have got Luna.
Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well. Today we've got a thrilling and interesting story lined up, so grab your headphones and let's dive straight into the story.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a case that really gripped the world for decades. The pursuit and ultimate capture of the Golden State Killer. We're not just going over the who and the what. Our mission is to understand the how, specifically the groundbreaking forensic techniques that finally brought this elusive criminal to justice after so many years.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and we have a compelling set of sources for this deep dive. We'll be looking at news articles covering the guilty plea and sentencing of Joseph James DeAngelo, the man we now know as the Golden State Killer. And crucially, we also have an in-depth document outlining the whole investigation, really focusing on the transformative power of forensic genetic genealogy.
Exactly. Our deep dive today aims to achieve a few key things for you. First, we want to understand those initial decades of the investigation, the challenges they faced, the sheer scope of the crimes. It was huge. Then we'll trace the pivotal moments that sort of reignited this cold case, leading us to the revolutionary forensic science that ultimately cracked it. And finally, we'll explore the significant ethical questions that came up for the techniques used. We need to grasp the broader implications of this landmark case. So let's get right into it. Where does this story even begin?
Well, the initial crimes stretched from the mid-1970s into the 1980s. It wasn't just one spree. It was more like three distinct waves that we later found out were connected. It started with the Visalia ransacker in Tulare County around 74, mostly burglaries, but tragically also the murder of Claude Snelling in 1975 during an attempted kidnapping.
Okay, Visalia ransacker first.
Then came the East Area Rapist, or ER. That started in 76, terrorizing Sacramento and Northern California. At least 50 rapes, and the murders of Brian and Katie Maggiore in 78.
50 rapes. Just staggering.
And then in 79, the attacks shifted south. That's when the original Night Stalker, or ONS, started. 10 confirmed murders, often coupled with rape, mostly in Southern California.
The geographic spread and the way the crimes evolved, it's almost hard to comprehend. You mentioned limitations in those early investigations. What were the biggest obstacles they were up against?
Oh, technology was a huge one. I mean, DNA analysis, as we know it today, it just didn't exist back then.
Right. No CSI magic back then.
Not at all. Investigators had to rely on more traditional methods, eyewitness accounts, but he wore a mask, so
Yeah.
not always helpful.
Yeah, makes sense.
Physical evidence like shoe prints, trying to link crimes based on, modus operandi, behavioral patterns. It was much more subjective, much harder work.
And it wasn't just the tech, was it? The scale of it, crossing different jurisdictions, that must have been a nightmare.
Oh, absolutely. Crimes happening across multiple counties. It made it incredibly difficult for different police departments, different sheriff's offices to effectively share information. Establishing formal links between what looked like separate crime sprees was really tough.
So they weren't sure it was the same guy initially.
Well, there is debate. For instance, the source material mentions Lieutenant Ray Root initially disagreeing with linking the ER rapes up north to the ONS murders down south. They saw maybe different methods. And there were concerns about negative press, too, linking so many horrific crimes.
So different agencies maybe thinking different MOs.
Yeah.
It sounds like a recipe for a disconnected investigation. I think I read something about evidence being destroyed, too. Is that right?
Yes, unfortunately. The statute of limitations for rape in California back in the 70s was only 3 years.
Only 3 years. Wow.
Yeah. So tragically, that meant some evidence from those early year cases was destroyed. But, and this is crucial, not all of it, investigators did manage to preserve some key items, particularly biological evidence from some rape kits. That turned out to be absolutely vital decades later.
Thank goodness for that. It's chilling, though, thinking about the perpetrator's methods, the mask, the gloves, those planned escape routes. People thought he might have had training.
That's right. His cunning was definitely a big factor in why he evaded capture for so long. He was meticulous, careful about concealing his identity, his movements, and the sources point out a couple of really striking, almost unbelievable missed opportunities early on.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, get this. In 1979, DeAngelo, the guy they eventually caught, was actually arrested for shoplifting, petty theft, right? But it got him fired from the Auburn Police Department.
He was a cop.
Yep. And his firing coincided almost exactly with the end of the East Area rapist attacks in Northern California.
Whoa.
Mm,
So if they'd connected those dots back then?
exactly. Hindsight's 2020, of course, but
Yeah.
if there had been better systems for cross-referencing, information sharing, it could have changed everything. Then again, in 1996, he was arrested for some kind of ruse at a gas station.
Another chance missed.
It really highlights the limitations before digital records, before sophisticated databases and offender profiling were common practice. Connecting seemingly random incidents was just much harder.
So sobering to think how close they might have been without realizing it. Okay, so after this intense but ultimately unsuccessful initial period, what happened? The sources talk about a cold period.
Yeah, after the last known ONS murder in 1986, the violent crimes seemed to just stop.
They just stopped.
Apparently. So, understandably, the investigation slowed down. Without new leads and still facing the limits of forensic tech at the time, the cases entered this long dormancy period. Plus, imagine the sheer volume of files, reports, evidence spread across all those agencies. Re-examining everything was a massive task.
So for more than 10 years, basically nothing new. Hard to imagine the frustration for investigators and just the ongoing pain for the victims and their families. But then, things started to change. The reopening triggers, as the deep dive calls them. What sparks things again?
Yeah, things did start to change. 3 key developments really brought the case back to life. The first, and arguably the most critical, was that DNA link in 2001.
Okay, tell me about that.
For the very first time, forensic analysis definitively connected the East Area rapist crimes in the North with the original Night Stalker murders in the South. They took semen evidence that had been preserved from an ONS murder victim, Charlene Smith, and matched the DNA profile to DNA from ear rape kits stored in Contra Costa County.
Wow. So proof positive, same guy.
Exactly. It confirmed they were hunting one person. That led to the combined name Aaron's East Area Rapist Original Night Stalker, and it really unified the effort, pooling resources and knowledge under this single, terrifying banner.
That must have been a huge moment, finally connecting the dots scientifically. And then you mentioned Michelle McNamara.
Yes, Michelle McNamara. She was a true crime writer, and in the 2010s, she played a really significant role. She actually coined the name Golden State Killer.
Ah, so that's where the name came from.
Yes, through her articles and her book I'll Be Gone in the Dark, which was published after her death, sadly, in 2018. Now, her work didn't directly point investigators to DeAngelo, but it undeniably raised public awareness. It kept the case in the spotlight, generated new interest, maybe even helped build support for renewed investigative efforts.
Kept the pressure on, in a way. Put a memorable name to the monster. And then there was another big push in 2016.
That's right. June 2016 marked the 40th anniversary of the first Ear attack. The FBI, along with the Sacramento County DA's office and other local agencies, launched a renewed national campaign. They offered a pretty substantial reward, $50,000 for information leading to his arrest and conviction. And importantly, Sacramento DA Anne-Marie Schubert was key in forming a dedicated task force around this time. It signaled a serious recommitment.
Okay, so we've got the DNA link confirming Aaron's. We've got increased public awareness thanks to McNamara, and a new official task force with reward money. But the ultimate key, the real game changer, was this investigative genetic genealogy. Right, let's get into that. What is IgG and how did it finally crack this thing?
Right. Investigative genetic genealogy, IgG, or sometimes FGG for forensic genetic genealogy, it's truly revolutionary. See, traditional DNA database searches like CODIS, the National Police Database, they rely on finding a direct match or maybe a very close relative like a parent or sibling.
And they hadn't found one for GSK and Cody's.
Nope. 0 hits after years of checking. His DNA wasn't in the system. So IgG takes a totally different path. It leverages the huge amount of genetic data that ordinary people have voluntarily uploaded to public genealogy websites.
Like the ones people use to build family trees and find relatives.
Exactly. People looking for their ancestry. Investigators took that preserved crime scene DNA, the semen samples, and used advanced lab techniques to develop something called a SNP profile. SNP stands for single nucleotide polymorphism.
Okay, S&P profile, how's that different?
Think of the traditional CODIS profile, like looking at maybe 20 specific signposts on a highway. A SNP profile is like mapping the entire highway system, plus all the side roads, towns, landmarks, hundreds of thousands of points across the whole genome, much, much more detailed.
So a much richer picture of the DNA.
Precisely. This super detailed SNP profile was then uploaded to a public genealogy database, GED Match in this case. GED Match at that time allowed law enforcement uploads for specific serious cases.
And how does uploading it there help find someone who isn't in the database themselves?
That's the genius of it. It works through family connections. Even if the perpetrator isn't in GED Match, some of his relatives probably are, maybe distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, even further out. By comparing the crime scene SNP profile to all the profiles in GED Match, genealogists can find people who share segments of DNA with the unknown suspect. These are genetic relatives.
So you find distant cousins. Then what?
Then the really meticulous work begins. Genealogists use traditional genealogy methods, birth records, death certificates, census data, obituaries, online trees, to build out the family trees of those distant matches. They look for common ancestors, then trace the lines back down through the generations.
Trying to find where the family trees intersect.
Exactly. They're looking for intersections that point towards a potential suspect who fits the profile. The right age range, lived in or had ties to the areas where the crimes happened.
That sounds incredibly complex,
Oh.
like finding a needle in a genetic haystack.
It is extremely complex and time-consuming. In the Golden State Killer case, the genetic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter reportedly spent about 4 months doing this intensive work, building trees, eliminating branches, narrowing it down.
4 months after decades of searching.
Right, and eventually this process led her to Joseph James DeAngelo, a name that, incredibly, hadn't been on any previous official suspect lists for the GSK.
Wow, so Barbara Raventer was key. And the deep dive also mentions Paul Holes and Anne-Marie Schubert again here.
Absolutely instrumental in this final push. Paul Holes, he was a cold case investigator with the Contra Costa County DA's office. He'd been chasing this case relentlessly for over 20 years. He was a huge advocate for trying IgG.
He saw the potential early on.
He did.
Yeah.
He worked really closely with FBI Special Agent Steve Kramer on this. Hole's persistence, his willingness to embrace this new kind of unconventional method was absolutely critical. And as we mentioned, DA Anne-Marie Schubert's leadership in forming that task force and her office's commitment to using DNA technology provided the essential backing and resources.
So they zeroed in on DeAngelo through the genealogy. But you can't just arrest someone based on being like a third cousin twice removed from someone in a database, can you?
No, absolutely not. That's a crucial point. The IgG provides a lead, an investigative target. It doesn't provide probable cause for arrest on its own. So once DeAngelo was identified as the prime suspect through the genealogy, investigators had to get a direct DNA sample from him to compare to the crime scene evidence.
How'd they manage that?
They conducted surveillance. And then they surreptitiously collected items DeAngelo had discarded DNA he had abandoned. Our sources mention getting DNA from his car door handle outside a Hobby Lobby and also from a tissue he threw in his trash can.
A tissue from the trash.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah. That abandoned DNA was then taken to the lab, analyzed using the standard methods, and directly compared to the original DNA profiles from the ER and ONS crime scenes. And it was a definitive match.
The final piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
After all those years. Just amazing. So the arrest happens in April 2018. What came next? The legal process must have been complex, too.
It was. Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested at his home in Citrus Heights, California on April 24, 2018. Reports say he was completely surprised.
I bet he was.
DA Anne-Marie Schubert had that memorable quote, "We found the needle in the haystack, and it was right here in Sacramento." He was initially charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder. That was later updated to 13 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, things like murder during a burglary or rape, plus 13 counts of kidnapping related to some of those murders.
But not the rapes directly.
No, because the statute of limitations had long expired for the rapes committed back in the 70s as the ER. But the kidnapping charges covered some of the same incidents. And the prosecution itself was a huge joint effort involving DAs from 6 different counties where the murders occurred.
And then, instead of what could have been an incredibly long and painful trial, they reached a plea bargain.
That's right.
On June 29, 2020, this was during the early pandemic, so they held it in a makeshift courtroom at Sacramento State University. DeAngelo, who was 74 by then, pleaded guilty.
To everything.
To all 26 charged counts, the 13 murders and 13 kidnappings. But here's the other staggering part. As part of that plea deal, which took the death penalty off the table, he also had to publicly admit to 161 additional uncharged crimes.
161.
Yeah, spanning 7 counties. These included dozens and dozens of rapes, attempted murders, Burglaries, basically acknowledging the vast majority of the crimes attributed to the ERONS, and even the Visalia ransacker, even though he couldn't be formally punished for them due to time limits. My God. Just hearing that number, why did the prosecution agree to the plea deal, taking the death penalty off the table?
Well, the sources outline several key reasons. A major factor was the age and potential frailty of many of the surviving victims and witnesses, dragging them through what could have been a decade-long trial, forcing them to relive that trauma in detail. There was a strong desire to avoid that.
That makes sense. Protect the survivors.
Exactly. DeAngelo's own age was also a factor. He was already in his mid-70s. There was a powerful desire for finality, for certainty, for both the victims and the public. Plus, apparently there were some potential legal challenges regarding the chain of custody for some evidence collected decades ago, which could have complicated a trial.
Right, so the plea guaranteed he'd be held accountable and admitted to the scope of his crimes without the risks and trauma of a trial. The deep dive also mentions the victim impact statements. That must have been incredibly raw and powerful.
Oh, absolutely. For several days in August 2020, leading up to the sentencing, dozens of survivors and family members confronted DeAngelo in court. They delivered these incredibly moving, often gut-wrenching statements about the decades of pain, fear, trauma, and loss they had endured. People like Chris Pedretti, who said her safety was shattered. Jane Carson Sandler describing the sheer terror.
And giving them a voice, finally.
Yes, it was seen as a crucial part of the justice process, a cathartic moment, allowing them to speak their truth directly to him after being silenced for so long.
And then the sentencing sealed it.
On August 21st, 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo received his sentence. 13 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus another 8 years tacked on. He's currently incarcerated at California State Prison, Corcoran. He will die in prison.
As Anne-Marie Schubert put it, as a convict, not an accused. A definitive end to a decades-long reign of terror. And as we've really highlighted, the forensic science, especially IgG, was just so pivotal. Can we talk more about how truly transformative this has been?
Yeah, the impact is hard to overstate. The Golden State Killer case wasn't the very first case solved using IgG, but its scale and notoriety really put the technique on the map. It was the ultimate proof of concept. While that 2001 DNA link connecting EAR and ONS was huge, IgG was the tool that actually identified the guy after CODIS failed. It showed the power of using those detailed SNP profiles from sometimes very old crime scene DNA and comparing them against public genealogy databases.
It just opened up a whole new avenue for cold cases.
Completely. Think about it. Traditional cold case work might solve a handful, maybe dozens of cases a year nationally through things like CODIS hits. IgG suddenly offered a way to potentially resolve hundreds, the process finding distant relatives, building the trees, using traditional investigation to narrow it down. That's now been replicated successfully hundreds, maybe even thousands of times.
The deep dive mentioned GED match reporting over 1,000 cases by the early 2020s. That's incredible progress.
It really is. The GSK success validated IgG for law enforcement agencies that might have been hesitant. It also led to the growth of private companies that now specialize in offering these forensic genetic genealogy services to investigators. It's genuinely changed the landscape for how previously unsolvable violent cold cases are approached.
But this powerful technique didn't come without questions, right? The deep dive brings up the ethical labyrinth.
No, it absolutely raised some serious ethical debates, primarily around genetic privacy.
How so?
Well, think about it. Most people who upload their DNA to sites like Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, or even GED Match do it for personal reasons, finding relatives, learning about their health risks or ethnic origins. They consent to that.
They're not consenting to help police catch a distant cousin who might be a criminal.
Exactly. They aren't agreeing to have their DNA used in criminal investigations that might implicate themselves or their relatives. It brings up this idea of becoming an unwitting genetic witness against your own family.
I see. That raises questions about informed consent.
It does. And also questions about warrantless searches. Is searching a public genealogy database, even one with specific terms of service, equivalent to searching someone's private genetic information without a warrant? The legal system is still grappling with that.
Do the genealogy sites react to this?
Yes. GED Match, the site used in the GSK case, faced a lot of user feedback and privacy concerns. They subsequently changed their policy. Now, users have to specifically opt in if they want their DNA profile to be searchable by law enforcement for violent crime investigations.
So you have to actively agree now. Did that affect things?
It significantly reduced the size of the database available to law enforcement, at least initially, although many users did choose to opt in later. Other big commercial companies, like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA, have maintained policies stating they resist law enforcement requests unless compelled by a valid warrant or court order. They generally don't allow the kind of searching used in the GSK case.
So it's an ongoing tug-of-war between solving crimes and protecting privacy. The genetic panopticon idea, the deep dive, mentions the fear that our genes could be constantly surveilled.
That's the core tension, yes. Balancing public safety and the desire to solve horrific crimes against fundamental privacy rights in this new era of widespread genetic data. It's a really complex ethical and legal challenge.
Definitely something we need to keep talking about. The deep dive also emphasizes the victim advocacy aspect throughout this long process.
And rightly so. The decades of trauma, uncertainty, and fear that the victims and their families lived with, it's unimaginable. Many survivors became very active advocates, working to keep the case alive, raise awareness, and push for answers.
Their voices were clearly important.
Immensely. And as we discussed, the decision to offer the plea deal was significantly influenced by considering their well-being and age. It showed a commitment to a victim-centered approach, even in the final resolution.
And those impact statements.
They were incredibly significant, not just for the individuals speaking, but as a collective reclaiming of the narrative, confronting him, sharing their pain and resilience. It was a powerful culmination of their long fight for justice.
It really highlights the human element behind the headlines and the science. Now, going back to the investigation itself, we touched on the early jurisdictional problems, but the eventual success really hinged on collaboration, didn't it?
Absolutely critical. Those early fragmented investigations across different counties definitely hampered progress. The breakthrough really came when there was renewed, focused interagency collaboration.
Like that 2016 task force.
Exactly. Bringing together the Sacramento County DA's office, the FBI, and multiple local DI offices under one umbrella was essential. They pooled resources, shared information more effectively. The FBI's involvement also brought significant resources to the table.
And the partnership between investigators like Paul Holes and the FBI on the IGG front seems key, too.
Yes, that collaboration between Holes, who had the deep case knowledge and persistence, and agents like Steve Kramer, who could help navigate the FBI resources and the newer technology, was a perfect example of effective partnership. The GSK case really became a model for how to tackle these incredibly complex, historical, multi-jurisdictional cold cases. You need that teamwork.
And all this has spurred changes in policy and law, too, right? It wasn't just the tech, but how we regulate it.
Definitely. The GSK case, because it was so high profile and successful, really acted as a catalyst. People realized, okay, this IgG thing works, but we need some rules around it.
So what kind of rules came about?
Well, the U.S. Department of Justice issued an interim policy on forensic genetic genealogical DNA analysis and searching back in September 2019. It provides guidelines for federally funded investigations. Basically, it says IgG should generally be reserved for unsolved violent crimes like murder, rape, or for identifying unknown human remains, and only after traditional methods like CODIS have failed.
Okay, so it's not the first resort.
Right. And crucially, the policy emphasizes that if IgG leads to a suspect, investigators must obtain a new DNA sample directly from that suspect, like the trash pull in DeAngelo's case, and confirm the match using standard STR testing before making an arrest based solely on the IgG link.
That direct confirmation is vital.
Absolutely. The policy also stresses handling the genetic data respectfully, considering privacy implications. States have also started looking at specific legislation because existing DNA laws were mostly written with CODIS in mind, not these public genealogy databases.
And the database companies changed their terms, too, like GED matches opt-in.
Exactly. Plus, there's ongoing legal scrutiny, particularly around the Fourth Amendment, unreasonable search and seizure, especially concerning how that confirmatory DNA sample is obtained. Is pulling trash legal without a warrant? Usually yes, but it's being debated in this context. Policy is definitely still evolving, often reacting to these new capabilities.
Fascinating how one case can drive so much change. Lastly, the deep dive mentions the role of the media and public interest, even citizen detectives. How important was that?
I think it was incredibly important, actually. The media attention, especially in later years, kept the case from fading away entirely. Michelle McNamara's work, as we said, was huge in terms of coining the Golden State Killer name and just amplifying public awareness.
Did her work help solve it directly?
Not in terms of identifying DeAngelo, no. Law enforcement was already pursuing the DNA and IgG path. But her book and articles definitely reignited public interest, maybe put pressure on agencies, and just kept the story alive in a powerful way.
And the public's interest in ancestry is what built the databases in the first place.
That's a great point. Without millions of people voluntarily testing their DNA and uploading it for genealogy, IgG wouldn't even be possible. So public interest was fundamental in creating the tool itself. And then you had things like in-depth journalistic investigations, like the LA Times Man in the Window series and podcast. They helped the public understand the complexities, the history, the impact on victims.
So sustained media focus really matters for cold cases.
It absolutely can. It prevents them from being forgotten, keeps pressure on authorities, and sometimes it might even jog someone's memory or prompt new information or resources to be allocated. Public interest is a powerful force.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into just a truly landmark case. To try and sum up, we've seen this decades-long investigation, initially hampered by the limits of technology and jurisdictional barriers, then finally broken open by the revolutionary use of investigative genetic genealogy. But the case also really underscores the critical importance of victim advocacy, that interagency collaboration, and the powerful role public awareness can play in the long pursuit of justice.
Absolutely. And as we think about this, it's impossible not to look forward. The Golden State Killer case really redefined the boundaries of what we thought was possible in solving cold cases. It starkly highlights this ongoing complex interplay between scientific advancement, ethical considerations, and the determined pursuit of justice, often in ways that were unimaginable just a few decades ago.
It really makes you wonder, what does this mean for the thousands of other cold cases still out there? And how do we continue to navigate that balance between harnessing these powerful tools for public safety and safeguarding individual privacy in this genetic age?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's something law enforcement, ethicists, lawmakers, and all of us really will be grappling with for years to come.
A powerful final thought indeed. For those of you listening who want to delve even deeper into this complex and fascinating case, we really encourage you to explore the resources we drew from today. It's a story that continues to resonate and has, well, profound implications. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks so much for listening, everyone. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, share, and subscribe. It really helps us out. Until next time, take care and keep your chores company.